Hello and welcome to this episode of Scholars in Conversation. My name is Georg Gangl. I am the coordinator of the Center for Philosophical Studies of History at the University of Oulu, from where we also record today. And today I will also be the interviewer. And in this format, Scholars in Conversation, we interview central figures in the philosophy of history. And today we definitely have one of them with us. Our interviewee is Professor Jouni-Matti Kuukkanen. Jouni-Matti is Professor for Philosophy at the University of Oulu. He's the, not the president, he's the director of the Center for Philosophical Studies of History, and he's also my boss. But I'm not going to introduce him here in any detail because we will have plenty of time throughout the whole of the interview to discuss his work, his distinguished career, and also the development of his thought. And we will also talk about the center shortly, which just turned 10 years old. I just say here as much that Jouni-Matti is probably one of the leading philosophers of history alive. And so it's a great pleasure to have him here with us, and he took the time to answer some questions. So thank you very much for being here, Jouni-Matti.
Thank you so much. Very pleased to be here.
Okay. Usually we begin this series of interviews with some biographical questions, not because we are so interested in the personal lives of people, but just because it seems like everybody has their very own and individual way into our little field, which is also says something about the field. Now, I mean, I know that you did your PhD on Kuhn and you started professionally as a philosopher of science. Could you let us know how you ended up in the philosophy of history, which is now, I think, your main occupation?
Yes, sure. It's obviously a long way. My first degree is in history from the University of Turku. It's a master's degree in political history. And that was maybe the first touch on philosophy of history. My teacher was Professor Jorma Kalela, who was interested in theory of history, perhaps the philosophy of history too. He was in touch with Frank Ankersmit, for example, and in his lecture courses, he went through some of his thinking. So that was the first contact. But then after that, I finished this degree in political history, but I was also studying philosophy. And then I moved on to philosophy almost completely and did a master's degree in philosophy as well. That was in New York, New School for Social Research. And after that, I went on to philosophy of science, working on a PhD. To cut the long story short, then I finally ended up as a postdoc in the Netherlands and kind of got reconnected with philosophy of history, with the tradition in the Netherlands, with the thinking of Frank Ankersmit and some others. And towards the end of that postdoctoral period, then I really decided to work more on philosophy of history. I thought it was from a philosophical angle anyway. It was a bit of an underworked topic. So I decided to work more and write a book about it. So that was during the time in the Netherlands as a postdoctoral fellow that I really make this big step.
Okay, great. You already got into another question I had, that you sort of started as an undergrad in history, and that whether this sparked your interest in the philosophy of history, which you, I think, answered with yes.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure, but it seems like not all too many nowadays professional philosophers of history have degrees in history. Maybe some have. I'm not privy to what all of them did. Do you think it helps you as a philosopher of history, or it's maybe even a requirement to being a philosopher of history to have a history degree as well?
Did you say philosophers of history?
Yes.
That's a good question if they have studied history. Now that of course depends on how strictly we take the term philosophy of history as opposed to theory of history. Because I feel most people in what we call theory of history have a degree in history, but don't have a degree in philosophy.
So it's the opposite.
So if we take the philosophers of history, I mean, strictly speaking, then what we demand of them, it's probably right that many of them don't have a degree in history. And some of them have a degree, or many of them have a degree in philosophy, but I don't think that crowd is very large in number. But what was my impression in any case, that the combination of having both degrees in history and philosophy is a very rare combination. I only know maybe one or two.
Yes, that's my impression too. Therefore, I was asking sort of. But you gave a very interesting answer that you said in theory of history it might be the other way around, that there's a lack of philosophical degrees, whereas it seems to be.
That's my impression, that many people haven't studied in any programmatic way philosophy. And
Okay, very interesting. Thank you. So I suppose then, and correct me if I'm wrong, got into the philosophy of history around 2010, 10. Can you let me know what you feel like the field was like when you got first involved in it? And maybe we will speak later more about how it has changed ever since, basically 15, nearly 20 years ago.
Right. It's a good question, because it's a very, of course, difficult to get a sense or understanding of the whole field. If I start from my interest was really this school, what we call narrativism, and mostly it's associated with Frank Anker-Smith and Hayden White's theorizing, and then of course some others as well. So when I entered, I thought that was still going strong, kind of a dominant tradition, so I wanted to understand it. I wanted to understand it, where it comes from, and what could I say about it. And I had some intuitions that it gets something right, maybe it doesn't get something else right. But then regarding the whole field, I didn't have a good view, perhaps, what the field was, other than I felt even then that it was not, it's not very clearly organized into camps, other than perhaps a narrativist school. So I would say it was back then fairly heterogeneous. But you're probably asking, how do I see it now? Or
yes, there was the
to anticipate.
What changed, if changed anything? Or
so it was a bit of a heterogeneous then, but I think it might be even more now.
Okay.
So there are, of course, new themes and topics that have emerged, like talking about from the post-humanistic perspective, or talking about the Anthropocene and few others. But then I feel there are lots of individual people working from their own topics, from their own perspectives, from their own interests. So, do we talk more about this?
Yes, I have later some more questions, but we can, because I was first want to say about something else that you mentioned. Beyond the heterogeneousness to which you might have contributed or not, you probably have contributed to unseating narrativism, if it ever was a dominant paradigm, because in 2015 you published the award-winning book, and I have it here, Post-Narrativist Philosophy of Historiography, and the award was given in 2016, I wrote it down, by the International Commission for the History and Theory of Historiography. Now, given the title of the book, it's called Post-Narrativist Philosophy of Historiography. Could you shortly outline what post-narrativism is and how it differentiates itself from narrativism? Because I think, to your credit, that the term has caught on. It has been used beyond you, so it caught something there in the debate too. So.
Yeah, it has caught on and got quite a bit of interest, and it's a good question. Why has it got on, and what does it mean? So let's begin with the idea of post-narrativism. What is the post suffix there? It clearly conveys the idea that post-narrativism is indebted to narrativism in some senses. And in what sense? It's the idea that the main scholarly contributions of historians are books or texts or something like whole texts or something that you find or it's formulated in the longer textual form. So I think that's something like the narrativist insight that I called, that they put forward some kind of thesis or comprehensive thesis by way of hundreds of pages in the book. So that's the way that we don't, like the narrativists seem to see their predecessors, the analytic philosophers of history, that they were too fragmentary. They focused on bits and pieces of a text and didn't take an account of the whole text. And I thought that was the narrativist inside, that I also was kind of starting point of my post-narrativism. But I felt then and this is perhaps best seen in the writings of Hayden White, that they really depreciated any kinds of epistemological evaluations, or didn't even see any role for them. And while I appreciate the narratives inside that there are problems of anything like, in any absolute sense, to tell the truth or get it right about the past, I still think or thought there must be a room for a rational evaluation. So I try to strike a balance between this kind of strong form objectivism, absolutism, and relativism. So we can give up on the absolute notion of getting it right and getting it true, but still have various ways to rank between different accounts of history, because it's certainly not that everything goes. It's not that every account is on a par. There are differences.
Great, yes, you have already outlined some of my follow-up questions, or pointed toward them. So one follow-up question that I have on this is very central in the book. You said, so it's about the whole, or a suitably delineated whole, and you call those theses, or sometimes also colligations, and this is a very common term in the philosophy of history up to a certain extent. Could you shortly outline in a bit more detail what is exactly a colligation? Maybe give an example and how a historian goes about crafting them?
Yes, it's a good question. Firstly, I would like to say that I would distinguish between theses and colligations. Theses of history can be colligations, but not necessarily. What I mean by thesis of history, that's the idea of what a historian is arguing for. So you might understand it, you might look at it from the point of view that historian, with his or her book, produces an argument or proposal how the past should be seen. And whatever that view is, whether it's that what I have used is sleepwalking thesis, that the great powers of Europe went to First World War like sleepwalkers, or anything like that. That would be the thesis, that would be the idea that the historian puts forward. Sometimes, of course, they can be colligatory in nature. And what is meant by colligation? Colligation is to put things together, to gather things together in order to make it something bigger, a whole. And so it organizes matter, historical data or historical traces, and thereby it creates a concept which then gives a sense of the past. So there are these famous examples of the Cold War, of the Renaissance. I've used in my book this Thaw that relates to the history of Soviet Union in the 1960s roughly, when after Stalin's death, the circumstances and the situation was getting sort of warmer, more liberal in the Soviet Union. So this thaw has been used to describe that period. How do historians make them? That's a very good question again. I mean, partly probably they are part of our discussion language already, but I haven't studied this. This is something that, you know, there will be much more work to do. Sometimes maybe a historian can be original enough and come up with an own colligation, and therefore bring this added sense to the past, added meaning to the past. But I'm pretty sure that they do not emerge from the data itself, from the past itself, unless we use the concept used by the past agents. But actually, historian has to use creative imagination or creative cultural imagination to construct them.
Yes, very interesting, thank you. I suppose there might be also differences between how different colligatory concepts came about. I didn't do any study on this obviously either, but there might be a difference between how something like the Renaissance came about, which I think Michelet and Burckhardt have coined themselves, and maybe something like the Thaw, which might have been in the cultural sense out there already up to a certain extent, not in the sense that it was used by the historians, but it's very interesting, yes. So then I would like to ask you next about the philosophical issue. You just said sort of thesis, and then of course also colligations. They are not just out there in the material, fully objective. And in a sense, you said they are not true. They cannot be understood truthfully or true functionally. But famously, you said this doesn't entail anything goes. So it's not like Contra Hayden White and maybe some other postmodernists. And you would say that they can still be rationally or sort of discussed. So then, how, according to your theory, how are these theses and then colligations too? How are they rationally justified? How do historians do that? Is it correct the way they do it? Should they do it the way they do it? Is there a normative issue that they do? And thirdly, because what is the understanding of rationality of rational that is part of that?
Right.
Take one by one, only one if you want. But
thank you for the question. That is actually many questions, but I'll try to run you and stop me at some point, or then we can reorient our discussion. I would like to start with the idea of truth, and why did I end up with suggesting that these historiographical theses are not true functionally available. The reason is, what is truth? Let's ask what is truth. And at the time, I thought, and maybe it's still correct to say, what is the most intuitive understanding of truth? So that's probably the correspondence notion of truth. So something is true by way of corresponding to something external, something mind-independent, like facts or nature or world or whatever we put forward. But if we begin with this idea of the correspondence theory of truth, then I concluded this correspondence theory does not apply to historical theses. And why is that? That's because historical theses they are often colligations. They contain, if we understand them as narratives or other kinds of theses, they contain all kinds of literary qualities, senses or meanings, which are not just out sitting there in the past. They are put forward by the historian, constructed by the historian or his culture, and in this way, he or she makes the past meaningful. So if there are these kind of subject-sided, that I call the subject-sided features, they cannot correspond to what there is in the past. But of course, parts and particles of the thesis can correspond. In principle, if we go with the correspondence theory by way of thinking about references, for example, references of names of people, the two places of people, or things like that, on that very simple level. So that was the reason why I say they couldn't be true. But then another intuition is, of course, that if anybody scribbles some account of history, it doesn't mean that the scribbling is better than the professionally produced account of history, or historian's account of history. And so it all comes down to the reasonings and the grounds for the statement, for the thesis that is put forward. So I started working on this assumption that we need to find some reason-making, rationality-making features that makes historians' argumentation warranted or persuasive. And this is, of course, makes, when I talk about this rationality, that the historical thesis can be rational, it is, of course, a little bit breaking up, and I did this consciously, breaking up with the epistemological tradition, where often rationality as a form of justification in any ways. If I have a rational reason to state something, it creates an expectation of this something being true. Okay, now I broke with this tradition, but I still try to, and one of my guiding ideas was look at to think about how historians act. What is their practice like? So I came up with these three dimensions of evaluation. So that's epistemological, rhetorical, and discursive, which would attend to different aspects that de facto in practice historians will and need to evaluate the other people's works, and depending on how well they succeed, measured by those criteria, then that is the degree of rationality. So to end this, what is the notion of rationality? I think we need it, and in this case, in the context of post-narrativism, it is very primarily discipline-specific, historiography-specific, which is not to say that it wouldn't be applications outside of it, because clearly when we talk about epistemic values, also in science and philosophy of science, they are discussed.
Mm-hmm. Great, yes. If I just a short follow-up, you have this, I think, called tripartite theory of historiographic justification.
Yes.
In that book again. And then now you phrased it that they will and need to engage in all three of them. Of course, these are slightly different things. That they will, or that they do it an empirical issue, they might, but that they need to, maybe nobody has, but do you have a good account of where they need to come, how to justify the need to itself? Or is this a wrong question posed? I'm not sure.
Well, okay, you are right. First of all, will is an empirical question, and of course we can find a group of historians who care not at all. But then, at least from the post-narrativist view, then becomes the need question, the normative question. And it is the suggestion, my suggestion in that book, in post-narrativism, those are the criteria. So you have to care about your epistemic values in terms of coherence and comprehensiveness and scope and originality, and there was also an exemplification. You need to care about the internal qualities of your reasoning, sort of argumentative qualities of what you put, that it's coherent, it's well connected, and so on. It's inferentially justified. But also you need to care about this discursive aspect, so that actually you know your field, you know the argumentative context. So this, I suggest that if, this is of course a normative suggestion, first of all, I suggest that if historian omits this, or is shown to be wanting in any of these aspects, then that's a defect. And of course, there is no ideal book, but this is what we should pay attention to. And I want to add this, that of course, again, I didn't do this empirical work, but I do believe that this is my belief, this is a rough approximation what also takes place in terms of evaluations.
Yes.
We will need to study that.
Yes. I share your intuition, for what it's worth. Okay, great, thank you. Now, since the book, you moved on, or expanded it.
Yeah.
You can let me know if you revised some of parts too. But as a first step, 2 years later or something, you started to calling your position rational pragmatism. I'm not sure if you still do that. What is the relationship of rational pragmatism and post-narrativism? And is one an improvement on the other, or is it just a different name for the same thing? Or
Right.
Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, it's a bit of this rational pragmatism. I should make clear, it's not my term. It's a term of Robert Brandom. And it is a kind of a middle way. I have a little bit moved on, although I think rational pragmatism is fine. So the big idea there is the starting point, I was urged to go further from post-narrativism all the way to pragmatism, which I kind of have tried to do now. And so we begin with practice in pragmatism, and also post-narrativism ends up with historiography as being a practice argumentation is practice. Producing a specific argumentative act, writing a book, publishing a book is an act. And now we need to know whether that act or that practice is good, whether it's justified, whether it's, or as pragmatist you say, it's warranted. So is the historian's claim about, let's say, the First World War, is it warranted? And there is a specific belief in rational pragmatism that rationality has a special role. So we need to, in order to be able to converse sensibly, have sensible discursive practice, we have to presuppose some idea of rationality. And that's, of course, is applicable to historiography in general, but also, as I just described, if we want to assess different accounts of history, we need to have some criteria, and we need to be able to say that these are the rationality-making criteria, and it may be in this situation more rational to accept this account than that account.
Okay, great. Yes, if I understood it correctly, sort of rational pragmatism is a broader position, not just in the philosophy of history, philosophy of historiography. And that brings me to another question. Before I want to talk about a few current hot topics in the philosophy of history. I know that you have been working on and now finished a book on pragmatism, more generally. Could you let us know the main ideas of that book and how that, what's the effect of that sort of pragmatism on the philosophy of historiography? Maybe you have already answered that partly, but...
Okay, so the name of the book is Doing, Knowing and Getting It Right, the Methodologism as Pragmatism, and it's hopefully forthcoming in, let's see, next half a year or a bit more than that. The book itself was going to be a pragmatist philosophy of historiography, but then I realized I need to go more in the details of pragmatism, and in this case, neo-pragmatism. So the book deals with, to a great extent, Sellarsian thinking, Wilfrid Sellarsi thinking, and of course Brandam's thinking. Wittgenstein is there in the background. They're also about Gilbert Ryle and Peter Winch and so on. So what's the main idea? I call it methodologism, and it's roughly starts with the assumption that we have rejected representationalism, which is also prominent in the post-narrativism philosophy of historiography. So what is the idea of representation? Representationalism is the idea that when it comes to, let's say, knowing and meaning, we assess knowing and meaning in terms of subject-object relation, so that subject is a representation of the object. And whether we know or whether we mean, it has to be some kind of match between those two. And there are various problems that I try to display in the book with the representationalism. But then if we move to anti-representationalism, pragmatism, of course we still want to have normativity. We want to know, we want to be able to say in what situation there's knowledge, we know, in what situation there's meaning, what is the meaning, and so on. So we need to rely on practice or doing. So we have to be able to make sense of knowing and meaning through doing. And that is the really main idea. And maybe the two of the well-known accounts in this line of reasoning is the use theory of meaning. So what is meaning? Meaning is the use, or more precisely, meaning is the role of an expression in language. And the other well-known is knowing how, or knowledge how. That's Ryle's initial position, and there's discussion. So I also tap on those, and then it gets to the key question. if knowing and meaning are defined through doing, it's obviously not any kind of doing that counts knowing or provides meaning. So we need to have some sort of way to differentiate between ways of doing. So of course, there's linguistic doing, another doing, but even amongst linguistic doing, not all kinds of linguistic doing, claiming. And the idea of methodologism that there are correct ways of doing. There are rule-bound ways either by our language, grammar of our language, or perhaps our disciplinary forms or disciplinary rules like historiography or something like that. And so the slogan there is the knowing is doing correctly when the claim, and that takes you back to the all the way to post-narrativism. So when the claim is correct in the sense that it's warranted, is all the warrants in terms of the disciplinary, good making, rationally making features, argumentative features, and all others, then it's warranted. It's claiming correctly according to those rules.
Great, thank you. So could one say that you have sort of developed the general philosophy which you arrived at in more limited terms in post-narrativist philosophy of historiography? The general philosophy that lies behind there, sort of this. Or it was already maybe implicit there but not worked out, and the notion of rationality and the notion of...
Yeah, that would not be incorrect thing to say. It probably this kind of pragmatist thinking has been in my mind for a really long time, but then I really discovered that in the context of post-narrativism. And indeed, as you say, it led me to more reading, more deeper reading, and I thought there is more to mine. And in a way, it's right. I'm happy to say that there is. And if you go down enough, I think you can create a whole comprehensive philosophy, which I believe it's a minority position, anti-representationalism, at least, if not pragmatism necessarily, but anti-representation is a minority position. And but it's well crafted, I think, in neo-pragmatism.
Okay, great. Okay, so I would like to, let's see about the time, but I would like to talk about at least 3 issues that are current issues in philosophy of historiography. And I think they all are in a good relation, or they relate to what you just said about pragmatism as well. Those are naturalism, realism, and the so-called practical or empirical turn. Maybe let's start with naturalism, because I feel like maybe there's an interesting debate here to be had. Because on one level, at least the rational part of rational pragmatism. There's, or maybe there's, for me, it sounds like maybe it's even something like a meta-philosophical difference there. But I know that you are very critical of naturalist or strong naturalist positions in the philosophy of historiography, as they have been, for instance, been forwarded in recent years by Paul Roth. Could you shortly just explain what is naturalism in that sense? What's the problem with it, and which position would you put against it, or instead of it? Sort of what is the philosophical approach that we have to take to? I would phrase that from the meta-philosophy of the philosophy of historiography. Maybe I don't like that. Some people don't like the term meta-philosophy, so correct me if this is the wrong way of putting it, but that would be the question.
Very good questions, but also very difficult questions, and I'm not sure if I can give you a very good answer or anything that would give any definitive sense in this. But I'll try to say something. The first thing to say is I have reassessed my relation to naturalism, first of all. It's true that I have been critical of what I call strong naturalism. And strong naturalism is basically the idea that any methodologically and ontologically everything is reduced to the sciences themselves, so the practices of sciences. And I saw there's a problem if also normativity is reduced to the sciences. So that's basically more or less descriptive, even sociological work of the sciences, how scientists behave, what they do. It's just if we do this kind of descriptive work, how we get any normative notions, let's say, what is good science? or what is ethical in science, or what is ethical in general. I mean, we describe different cultures. We still don't get the view of what is moral. So I thought there is a task for philosophy to do, and that is to define what is good, what is bad, what is acceptable, what is unacceptable. They do not seem to be given out there. But then, of course, I think that's still a good question, how normativity can be understood in terms of strong naturalism. There are some attempts, like Stephen Turner has tried to explain morality through, as I understand, through more like a sociological descriptions of what communities or members of a community believe what is acceptable. But then, of course, naturalism is not necessarily so far from pragmatism. So they are natural allies in the sense of both achieve this kind of a priori philosophy. They are not bound to do metaphysics. They want to learn from the practices of people and then maybe use some sort of a rational reconstruction of those practices of people. They dislike some debates that seems to be just merely scholarly debates with not really much what we call the pragmatical or practical differences. But then, of course, it has its tensions. Even Brandom has described the situation of rational pragmatism in one of his interviews, that there might be a little bit of a tension there, that in his words, that well, pragmatism does not insist on making always very sharp, at least sharp in the sense of universal or ahistorical definitions, because it very much studies the locality and contexts in the locality and communities and the times in the historical contexts, and understands that, for example, notions of rationality may be contingent and variable. But nevertheless, this tension is that while pragmatism does not insist on sharp distinctions, rationalism or rationality often does. Mm-hmm. In his case, it's the situation that as humans or as users of language, we must just possess a notion of rationality or capability for rational discursive practices. So I'm more a friend of a naturalist than I used to be. Okay. Although I'm still unsure whether I would define it myself as one.
And perhaps this is too strongly put, with an a priori notion of the irrationality, if that works together. I mean, I don't know how it goes together exactly, if it does at all, but is it fair to say?
It's probably not fair to say.
Okay.
I mean, I can understand why you say it, but if you can have, I mean, there are many ways to say actually, but if you think about language as something that, like Brandom calls it concept mongering, creatures have learned to use, it may be hardwired, yes. It may be something that evolutionary people have learned to do it. So there's actually, you could turn it into a naturalist pragmatist story by telling an evolutionary story, how this specific skill came about, why it has a value for practical and even survival, and value for us. Yes.
Okay. Yes. Let's move on. I have no good answers to this either. I would like to talk next about realism. There's a on one level, of course, what you said about post-narrativist philosophy of historiography, at least thesis and collocations are, in your opinion, or at least in the book, and I think now still, not amenable to a realist treatment. But recently in philosophy of history, philosophy of historiography, we have seen a resurgence of realism. They're called the new realists. And there's quite some debate, and on the one hand you have engaged with them, so you are, I think it's fair to say, one of the preeminent critics of, but you're also one of the preeminent objects of criticism of the new realists, partially also, for your views on colligations. Could you try to tell us what you think about this new wave of realism, and what is your main criticism of it?
Right. Yes, it's an interesting orientation. It's of course nothing new or fresh as such. I mean, realism is an old topic in philosophy of science, in any case, maybe philosophy more generally. It seems that those who advocate it have a strong intuition that realism must be correct. And I'm kind of still looking forward to seeing the real argument for that. And what it requires, to my mind, is to, if it's the realism, that's the real bone, the real issue, then I think one needs to understand the debate on realism and anti-realism very well. And that means, to my mind, scientific realism as opposed to scientific anti-realism, because there's so much discussion for many decades in philosophy of science. And I haven't seen that recognition yet. Then another thing is, if you want to do and apply it in philosophy of historiography, we cannot do it on the basis of our intuitions that we believe something is right, because it's the danger of being very shallow discussion. So one has to also study philosophy of historiography, in particular narrativism, I think. And not only that one looks for bits and pieces that can be used to support one's argument, but actually understanding narrativist inside, understanding and appreciating, and then showing maybe why it's deficient. And yeah, I think there's more work to do in those two fronts.
Okay, great.
Can I add?
Yeah, please continue.
Now, being a pragmatist, self-confessed pragmatist these days, I'll have grown a little suspicious about the value of realism and anti-realism debate. I've been myself very interested in ever since I encountered it and read in the 1980s debates, when it was very big in philosophy of science last time. And then, of course, after that, there is more newer, fresh discussion. But I'm not sure how useful that discussion in the end is. What changes if one is realist or anti-realist from the pragmatist perspective? So I'm less interested in, and less hopeful that something interesting comes out of it than I perhaps used to be. Right.
But you're very invested in the debate for not being that interested.
Yeah.
That can happen, I guess.
Sure.
Yes, so the next topic we want to talk about, it has perhaps to do with realism, or it might be one way of making realism interesting again, or debatable, or to forward the debate, is sort of what has been called the practical or empirical turn in the philosophy of historiography, about which both of us spoke a few weeks ago too favorably at the 5th INTH conference in Lisbon, even though you had also some quite critical remarks about which I would like to talk to you. Could you shortly tell us what's the idea behind a practical turn? What's the potential of it, perhaps, and what's the problem with it?
Yes.
Maybe in relation to realism or not, doesn't need to be realism, can be just general.
Yeah, thanks. So we both, and maybe some others have, kind of calling for it. And as I understand, the idea is really make this our discussion more tangible and more warranted. So there are many ideas, and post-narrativism is one idea, what historiography is about. And now, wouldn't it be time to look at the actual practices, let's say evaluative practices of historians, find out, are they committed to certain epistemic values de facto? Many have claimed that they are. I have claimed, are they? What is other rule-bound disciplinary specific practices that they do? On the other hand, shouldn't we be looking at the books of history, how they are structured? are they argumentative? Are they producers of narratives, or are they descriptors, or do they complete? What is the field in total? So let's have more hands-on study, and I think that's, to my mind, it's a very sensible thing. It's not necessary to claim that by doing this so-called empirical studies you can sort out the philosophical questions, but at least you can make your philosophical claims more plausible or belief-worthy. In itself, it doesn't relate to realism question. Mm-hmm. To me, the realism question is, and we could talk at length this, but first of all, when we make claims about anything, we are concerned whether the claim has certain kind of epistemic authority, means it should be believed and why it should be believed. If they add a realistic flavor, then we are making it something special. So it's a kind of elevating word. So we are talking about the status of our claims, that they are real, they are not clear, they correspond to something or something like that. And that requires certain kind of metaphysical work, I think. Mm-hmm. And it's not immediately called for in any case.
Mm-hmm. What do you say about if I said, if I was committed to a certain form of realism in historiography, then I also commit myself to that historiography should look a certain way. That there's a certain form of consensus on certain things, and maybe the whole discipline can't be all over the place and totally warring, and there's no consensus whatsoever. So in that sense, there are some empirical or practical expectations, at least, coming out of philosophical positions, and they should at least be somehow checked against the actual track record of the discipline. Whether or not they can decide it is a difficult question, of course, but would you agree to that? And at that level, realism, as anti-realism, as narrativism, as any position, should formulate expectations.
In principle, that approach, I very much agree. I mean, that would be actually a pragmatist way to look at it. So your philosophical commitments have practical consequences, and let's look at the practical consequences. However, if two allegedly contradictory positions do not have different practical consequences, then that seems to be actually, pragmatically thinking, it's an idle philosophical debate. So indeed, if you're a realist, if you're anti-realist, you must show that it has some practical consequences or expectations, and I think that is a very good approach to consider.
Okay, great, thanks. Now, before we move on to the philosophy of science, in which you also have made substantial contribution, one more question about the relationship of the philosophy of history, or the philosophy of the historiography, to what is also called historical theory or theory of history. Because, I mean, if I link this back to the practical or the empirical turn, one could say we're using this rather unusual term, philosophy of historiography, and one could, at least in some definitions of philosophy of historiography, sort of the practical or empirical term, or empirical work must be part of it, otherwise it wouldn't be philosophy of historiography. So could you maybe, at one point of the question, shortly outline what is the philosophy of historiography, and why that term, and why is it important to do that? And then also relate it to what has been called historical theory or theory of history. Because the way I see, I mean, you have said that our field, philosophy of historiography, is very heterogeneous, and I agree to that too. But there's this other field called theory of history, or historical theory, which is just at least as heterogeneous. It draws a lot of different theoretical references in. And if there's any kind of commonality, you could say it researches or is interested in our relations to the past in the broadest sense. That's what Hermann Power put it. So I guess the question is, from a philosophy of historiography standpoint, after we clarify what that is, what is your assessment of the theory of history and the relationship of the philosophy of historiography to the theory of history?
Right. It's difficult to say. I mean, you're right. My point in the beginning about heterogeneity was more a reflection on the larger field, including theory and philosophy of history, as it's called. And I think the minority of that is probably that are literally philosophers of history or philosophers of historiography. I guess what is philosophy of historiography? That's again not a difficult thing to define, but I guess it is philosophy first of all, and it is interested in understanding what this field called historiography, what is it about, what kind of explanations it uses, what mode of presentation it uses, what are key concepts, foundational concepts in it, what are the main assumptions, including knowledge, is it the knowledge production, and in what sense, and all these kind of questions that have really close and inherent links to many other philosophical mainstream or other philosophy of science discussions. So in this sense, if we understand historiography as a field that in some sense tries to increase our understanding of the past or even produce knowledge of the past, it has some principled ways to do it. It is, of course, institutionalized. I think it's a subfield of philosophy of science in that sense. It may have, and of course it has, its own discipline-specific questions. But otherwise, I think it belongs there. Theory of history is so large, and indeed so heterogeneous, it's very hard to say what it's about, other than people are interested in history, disciplines of history, ways of writing history in so many different ways. And I guess you can see it as a strength that there are so many people involved. We were just in the INTH conference in Lisbon. It was a big conference, there were many people. But I'm more worried about the state of philosophy, really, because theory of history seems to be booming. I think the names theory and philosophy still are apt. Theory seems to be something that people want to write. It's more like synthesizing, I want to say a thing about the field or its field's relation to something. And maybe in philosophy you are more down to going more slowly, a little bit more analytically, or focused on more analysis, and are in general more respectful to tradition of philosophy, in particular philosophy of science, analytical philosophy. Yeah.
Great.
I guess that's what I
Okay,
would say.
thanks. Before we move on to philosophy of science, just a little, call it commercial break.
Yeah.
If you're interested in the state of the philosophy of history, Jouni-Matti has also edited a book called Philosophy of History, 21st Century Perspective. Came out in 2021, I think it's about 15 contributions of leading philosophers of history, Jouni-Matti included, where sort of you can get a good overview, I suppose, of the field and what it's currently about. Right, so I still want to talk to you about the philosophy of science and our little center that now had its anniversary. So let's shortly a few questions on the philosophy of science. As we said in the beginning, you started out professionally as a Kuhn scholar, I would say. Correct me if that is wrong. You're laughing already, so maybe correct me if it's wrong. Do you have something like a specific interpretation of Kuhn, or or maybe less demanding, do you think there's a specific part of Kuhn that is now particularly relevant in the philosophy of historiography, perhaps, but beyond, obviously also in the philosophy of science or general culture, if you like, answer as you wish?
Yeah, that's many questions as well. But it's true that after moving to philosophy, I always found Kuhn very inspiring. And as how I understand Kuhn is one way to understand is Kuhn focused on history of science. But he wanted to do philosophy, as he himself also, philosophy out of history of science. And then that's a great promising thing. And that's the most promising thing, I think, for philosophical theoretical discussions about history. My own position, I guess the one line has been recently that I tried to sort of appreciate Kuhn's view overall, including the later Kuhn, because the later Kuhn is different. His views on, let's say, revolutions or incommensurability or paradigms change, and people usually know only the younger Kuhn. So that's one thing. For example, he talks a lot about the evolutionary development of science, takes it very, very seriously in this latter part also, although it's mentioned also in the early career when he wrote the structure of scientific revolutions. So my own view, I have tried to, appreciate Kuhn's view, that Kuhn's view is based on historical insight, and then I have tried to maybe express them in some more contemporary philosophical terms. And I have defended this kind of, regarding the scientific development, this kind of coherentist perspective, that on the basis of historical, we assume that scientists try to improve the accounts to make them more coherent, and then we have to see where this science is going or moving. Is it becoming more fragmentary, split into subfields? Is it producing internally or even externally altogether more coherent worldviews? So I've been interested in that, but also defended Kuhn's account of that Kuhn has the theory of rationality, because although he seems to be denying it sometimes, nevertheless he applies the same set of epistemic values across the times and across the paradigms. And that has actually an interest in realism and scientific realism debate, whether we can conclude if the science becomes ever more connected and coherent, which turned out not to be the case on Kuhn's historical analysis according to the later Kuhn, because he seems, it's like an ever-growing tree, evolutionary tree, more fragmented, more specialized, which can be very good on the special topics, have developed their own languages, own concepts, on problems, but are not necessarily compatible with all the other fields.
So no unity of knowledge.
No unity of knowledge. Yeah, that's what we know.
For better or worse.
Yeah.
Right. So the epistemic values that Kuhn thought up or they used, you employed in post-narrative philosophy of historiography as well, right? More or less, maybe.
More or less.
With some,
more or less the same.
So I don't want to stay too long on Kuhn. It's fascinating, but could one say that because Kuhn tried to do philosophy of science via the historiography of science, to a sense, did he, in his own way, try to do an empirical or practical turn in the philosophy of, in the historiography of science? Sorry, that way around.
Yes, very much. I mean, what was it called? It was the historical turn.
Yeah.
So their preceding tradition was the logical positivism and then empiricism, including Hempel and others who, I guess it's fair to say that understood science through theories of science, and theories of science as some kind of in a static form, and therefore you could analyze the explanatory models, you could analyze the logic or different kinds of languages and their relations to the external world. So you have this kind of theory of the language of science. So what Kuhn and other historical philosophers did, they turned this static model into a dynamic model. So science is evolving, moving, and another way to say is that whatever we say about science, it has to be exposed to the historical test, empirical test in this sense. So let's see, if you claim about science is this or that, if you claim about science is that scientists are committed to a specific method. So let's see and study the history of science and see whether that fares well or whether it doesn't. So that's what they really did.
Well, thanks.
So in that sense, it's kind of the same thing as the empirical or practical term.
And I suppose something that came out of Kuhn is, maybe not historically, you correct me if that is wrong, is HPS, History and Philosophy of Science.
Yeah.
So as this kind of putting together perspectives of philosophy and historiography.
Yeah.
But then you have called HBS also a failure before.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm not going to ask if Kuhn's perspective failed too, but we could talk about that too. Because you have said that they operate with different and incompatible metaphysics. Could you shortly explain why HBS, despite the right approach, if it was the Kuhnian one, perhaps failed? And is there potentially a way it might not fail? I ask this particularly because in our discussions, Hermann Paul has recently also argued for something called HPH, History and Philosophy of History or Historiography, specifically we've said modeled on HPS. But if HPS failed, and perhaps it was bound to fail, then HPH, by extension, must also fail. So could you shortly say?
Yes.
On the failure and the degree of failure?
Yes, don't quote me on that.
You have a paper called that. The failure of HPS, right?
Right.
So you quote yourself.
True. Yeah. Okay. Yes, I have said that it's not my firm conviction that it has that it will fail, or it's a failure as such.
Okay, that might be a failure. Okay, I got the record. I might have misquoted
it is true that I don't think it has so far succeeded in the way it was expected to succeed, and despite the rather energetic efforts both in the UK, they have an own network, and then integrated HBS, and then in the USA. So people have attempted. Well, I can mention Hasok Chang, one of the main exponents of this integrated HBS. So this failure of marriage, so to speak, is well recognized in literature. So that's one thing to say. Another thing is to say, what I mean by it is that it still seems like historians of science, philosophers of science are working separately, not necessarily in interaction, and even less towards some common goal. And that's the reason they don't always seem to be talking as well as they should. And of course, from a philosopher's point of view, the historian's interest might be not philosophical at all. And a historian's point of view, then the usual idea of philosophers' view is that they don't have connection with reality or something like that. But I urge you to go and see actually Hasok Chang's work. He is the one who is both historian and philosopher of science and has tried to integrate it. I think there is a good work for someone to consider. There are some papers you can find fairly easily to consider what would be the methodology of history and philosophy of science. Because mostly the tension is there, that the historian is considered as a descriptive field and philosophy as the normative field. So if you have a descriptive interest, you want to claim how they are, and then you have normative claim how they should be, it seems to be hard to put them together. And that's usually the tension. And I mean, in a way, I just throw it out. Of course, this rational pragmatism or anything like that might have something to say also, because it takes the practice seriously. But it puts the normativity very much on the foundation of all our discursive practices. So just open.
Okay. So rational pragmatism as the method of HBS could be a
we could study. We should study that. We should look at that carefully.
You said you said rational pragmatism. I immediately had Lakatos in my mind as a potential methodology for HBS, but maybe there's not a discussion for here. But
Lakatos, I didn't have Lakatos in my mind actually. I had more like this neo-pragmatist.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. I didn't mean that Lakatos was a pragmatist. I just had a different thought there that maybe Lakatos would be a way.
Yeah, Lakatos' idea of rational reconstruction. Lakatos. I guess Lakatos is being rehabilitated, and for a good reason philosophically, because I think it's still a more philosopher's project. But I think Lakatos is a lot more sensible and reasonable, also from the historical perspective, than people.
So perhaps Lakatos would only be the methodology for the philosopher who approaches historiography, not a shared methodology for both. If we can have something like this, I wouldn't know if that could exist. That would be an open.
I mean, one way to understand or discuss this specific issue is whether Because Lagatos, as I see Lagatos, is his idea of that, what he claimed about history of science. The history of science is written through frameworks. So whether it's a falsificationism or conventionalism or inductivism or his own methodology of research programs. So it's in kind of theory-laden. So there is no peer description as such in some Rankian sense. And if that's true, then there's always this kind of reconstructive element. And if you're claiming the otherwise, you are disillusioned. But that's one of the claims that we could have.
Yeah. And there's the famous feud in one sentence between Kuhn and Lakatos, right? About if it's just philosophy making up examples, or I don't know exactly.
Fabricating.
Yeah, fabricating this sort of stuff.
Yeah, he said, of course, that the philosophy of science without history of science is empty, and history of science without philosophy of science is blind. So it's not a bad idea. Yeah,
and it's a famous. It comes from Kant originally.
It comes from Kant.
Not the philosophy of science, obviously. Yes. Okay, great. Just one more question on the on your work on the philosophy of science, and then we finally speak about the center shortly. Another interest of yours has been what you have called the philosophy of the history of thought and the philosophy of concepts. And I think these are both. The first is a very interesting term because it's not much used, and the second is very interesting because it's not always clear what are concepts and how people use them. So let me ask you, what are concepts exactly in your understanding, and what is the history of thought and its philosophy?
Right. Okay. What is a concept? It's not an easy question. If I got everything, I go straight what I think about it, and I think the we're gonna have a good theory of concept through the use theory of meaning. So that's the Sellarsian functionalism, practically. So I would understand a concept. It's a role of an expression as it's used in a language. So it's kind of abstraction of that role. So it's a kind of abstraction of this linguistic role. And this, through this understanding, we might be able to quite tangibly analyze how the terms, of course, concept is not the term, but when we look at the terms, the words, how they're used, we are able to come to an abstraction of that role, and that would be the concept. Okay, not many have worked out. You can find something, but this is something that I could work. Then, of course, if you think about it from the perspective of what I call philosophy of history of thought, I think it's an interesting field, and again, very, very much underworked. There are various traditions that practice this kind of thing and also put forward something like a concept or a notion of a concept or an idea. So we can think about Lovejoy's history of ideas. We can think about the German Begriffsgeschichte. We can think about the Skinnerian Cambridge School. We can also think about maybe what historians of philosophy do implicitly. We can think about what used to be cognitive history and philosophy of science. They are mining on the cognitive science and the theories of concept. Of course, we have many theories of concepts in philosophy that may or may not be useful. We have a Phrygian, a Platonist tradition that may or may not be useful in the context of the history of thought. We have this kind of functionalist theory that I just displayed. So what this philosophy of history thought, this would be just one question to study what is the main organizing unit. So what is it, a concept? What is a concept? Is it a linguistic item? What kind of linguistic item? How it should be studied? How, for example, is change from this kind of unit to another seen, understood, defined? What follows from that? And all these kind of interesting questions that what is the relation to practice, of course, people's practice. All these kind of interesting questions would come down to study under this field.
Okay, great.
But very much underway.
Yeah. It's quite some work to be done still.
Ah,
For you, us, everybody.
Yes.
Not enough. One lifetime is not enough, perhaps.
Yes.
Okay, now, but finally, we'll come to the jubilatory part of this interview, which is talking about the Center for Philosophical Studies of History, which just turned 10 years old this year. Mm-hmm. And this interview is part of hopefully some activities in autumn that we will have celebrating the 10 years anniversary. Mm-hmm. But let's begin at the beginning. About 10 years ago now, or exactly 10 years ago, you founded the Center for Philosophical Studies of History at the University of Oulu, whose director you have been ever since. What prompted you to open up your own center?
Right. Yes, amazing. It's 10 years ago. Why did I do it? I mean, one was really the observation that there weren't really any centers. So, in other words, no one had decided to focus on philosophy of history. And I just moved to here. I just started to work in Oulu, so I thought, well, let's focus here. Let's gather resources here. So this field deserves this focus, this attention. So, of course, it would be good for this University of Oulu, to have this one recognized area of expertise. It would be good for the field, for the philosophy of history itself, to get it rolling, to have some progress in philosophy of history and on international level. Mm-hmm. It's really the foundational idea that no one had done it, so someone should do it. So I thought, let's do it.
Yeah, great. Yes, and it brought me here too, so I should not complain.
Yeah. It has
so then,
success.
Can you shortly explain what the center does and how it developed over the last 10 years? Can you shortly explain? It's a bit self-congratulatory. It's a success story.
Yes.
I think it is a success story. People might disagree.
It is a success story, not in all respects, but in many respects. Yes. I mean, it has. I guess it's fair to say that it's become well known internationally. We are, as if you're watching this, you know, we are active in the sense we organize these online lectures, host visiting scholars, also disseminate information, mainly thanks to you now, through social media mainly, and otherwise just try to get people's attention and focus on philosophy of history and try to explain its value to other academics and maybe to the wider world. We do also, of course, these interviews, and we have tried to collect a group of people, like-minded, philosophically, academically, together, who would be working on this topic.
Mm-hmm. Yes, great. But still, given the goals that the center had, perhaps, here in Oulu, but also for the field in general, it seems like there's still always the complaint that the philosophy of history lacks intellectual and institutional recognition within both philosophy and historiography. Do you think this sorry state is likely to change in the future, maybe through the work of the center? It's a bit high-minded, perhaps. Or what would need to happen for the philosophy of history to receive the recognition that we both think, I think it really deserves?
Yes.
It's our problem in a sense.
It is a problem.
Forever.
And to add to the success story, of course, where we haven't succeeded is to gather proper amount of funding, external funding or internal funding. So we don't have that, unfortunately. We tried, but haven't got that recognition. So how to improve the situation, or whether the situation might be improved or not. I think one thing internally is to really make this philosophy of history more rigorous. I think we have to spend more time on that and get sure that people also study philosophy for the sake of philosophy of history. That's one way to earn recognition among philosophers, in any case, and maybe more widely. Another is, of course, if philosophy would become institutionalized in the sense that it would be taught in universities, or I mean, this is kind of obvious. Or more people would have a job in universities to teach this field, and then there is hope for that you're generating new generations and increased interest. And if there's increased interest, there's probably more funding and more than recognition in the end.
Yeah. Right. And on a small scale, at least, there's increased interest in the center.
Yes.
If that counts for anything,
there
must be interest.
There is
interest there. So there's interest there. It's scattered and difficult to get together, but the center does its little part in it to focusing it at least.
Yes.
Okay, great. Then a final question for you. We are closing the end. We spoke over an hour, I think, which is great. Where would you want to see the philosophy of history on the center to be in 10, 20, 50 years? Take it.
Right.
Take whichever amount, or maybe 100 years. Take whichever you want.
Okay. Let's think about 10 years.
Okay.
That's
no prophecy.
That's what I can
we
still.
We don't prophesize. Okay.
That's what I can still imagine. What the world would look. I guess it would be nice if it had. It was a proper research center, meaning it had funding. It was able to fund scholars. So, doctoral and postdoctoral, maybe some senior, it has had some fellowships, and it would also do postgraduate education. So that's a master's and doctoral education. And maybe on the top of that, it would then be able to have some societal influence, because I think philosophy of history can also be used to contribute to our understanding of the phenomena that happen, including political phenomena around the world. So I think that would be another expertise that hasn't been used so far. That's the vision. So
no predictions or prophecy for 20, 50, 100 years in the future?
No, I decline.
Okay. Well, I guess we are now approaching the end. I guess what I can say, if you want to support the center or make a donation, you can contact us.
Yeah.
And thank you very much, everybody, for watching this, and we'll see you soon next time. And check out our social media and our homepage. Our autumn seminar is already in the planning, and it will start in September. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. It has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.